It all began with a gamble that everyone in my town thought was foolish. A decision that raised eyebrows and made me the laughingstock of the neighborhood for weeks. But if you stick with me until the end of this story, you'll see how one old wooden house, bought for just $2, became the key to a fortune worth $10 million, and why the HOA nearly lost their minds trying to steal it from me. So hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear is one of the wildest HOA battles you'll ever come across. The kind that proves you should never underestimate someone's determination when it comes to protecting what's theirs. I still remember the first time I laid eyes on that house. If you could even call it a house at the time, it looked more like a pile of rotting timber than a home. Standing lopsided on an overgrown lot at the edge of a small community controlled by one of the most overbearing HOAs in the county. The place had been abandoned for decades, the roof sagging, windows shattered, weeds climbing up the sides like nature had already claimed it for good. When the auctioneer announced the bidding was starting at $2 because the property had unpaid taxes and nobody wanted to take on the responsibility, I felt a thrill shoot through me. People laughed when I raised my hand. Some even muttered, "Why bother?" But nobody else bid. So, with the bang of a gavel, that wreck became mine. For months after that, the HOA board members sneered every time I walked past, whispering about how I was throwing money away and how they'd never let that, I swore, bring down the value of their pristine community. They thought they could bully me into abandoning it, especially Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. A woman who had made it her life's mission to control every blade of grass in the neighborhood. From day one, she cornered me with her thin smile and sharp words, insisting that the house violated dozens of HOA codes, even though the HOA technically had no authority over it because it sat just outside the official boundary lines. That little detail never stopped Karen. She believed everything within sight of her house was under her command, and she made it clear she wanted me gone. But I had a vision. What the others saw as trash, I saw as treasure. The wood in that old house was rare, hand-cut beams from the early 1900s. Solid oak that had withstood time itself. The foundation, though hidden beneath years of neglect, was sturdy, and the lot was positioned near a road that was soon scheduled for redevelopment by the city. Slowly but surely, I started working on it, salvaging beams, repairing the roof, restoring it piece by piece. Every night after my day job, I'd head there with a hammer, nails, and sheer determination. Neighbors scoffed, HOA members smirked, and Karen even filed fake complaints with the county, trying to get my project shut down. But nothing stuck because technically she had no jurisdiction over me. The more she tried to stop me, the more motivated I became. One evening, while I was hauling out a pile of rotted boards, an older man stopped by. He introduced himself as Mr. Fletcher, a retired architect who had seen me working tirelessly. He told me the wood in my house was worth a fortune if reclaimed properly, because it was the kind collectors and luxury builders paid top dollar for. That night I didn't sleep. One researched everything I could about reclaimed wood, heritage homes, and real estate value. And I realized my $2 house wasn't just a fixer-up, it was a gold mine waiting to be uncovered. Over the next year, I invested every spare dollar and hour I had into the project. I hired contractors when I could afford them, traded labor with local craftsmen, and even sold small bundles of reclaimed wood to fund new repairs. The house transformed before my eyes from a wreck to a restored masterpiece, blending historic charm with modern touches. And as fate would have it, the city's redevelopment project expanded the road right past my property, suddenly making my lot prime real estate. That's when the calls started coming. Developers offering millions for the property, luxury buyers wanting to turn it into a showcase home, and investors begging to buy the reclaimed wood alone. Within 2 years, the house and lot were appraised at nearly $10 million. And that's when Karen and her HOA board went insane. They claimed the property had always belonged to the HOA and that my deed was invalid. Despite the county records clearly showing I bought it fair and square, they filed lawsuit after lawsuit, stormed my property with bogus violation notices, and even tried to put up a sign labeling my home as community property. But I was ready for them. I had every receipt, every permit, every document lined up. I knew Karen's typesheet was a bully who thrived on intimidation, but once you stood your ground, she crumbled. The battle was just beginning, and as much as they thought they could scare me into walking away, they didn't realize they were about to trigger a legal war that would end with Karen's name dragged through the mud and the HOA's reputation destroyed forever. Karen's desperation reached a fever pitch after the financial records scandal because while most HOA leaders would have retreated to do damage control, she decided instead to go on the offensive, lashing out with every ounce of venom she had left, and in doing so, she made the fatal mistake of crossing boundaries that no one, not the law, not the community, not even her most loyal supporters, could excuse. It began with a smear campaign, flyers mysteriously appearing in mailboxes around the neighborhood, accusing me of fraud, of being a squatter, and even of fabricating the deed to my property. The lies were so absurd that at first I laughed, but then I realized how effective Karen's manipulation could be when I noticed certain neighbors glaring at me with suspicion again, forgetting everything they'd seen play out in public. That was Karen's gift, and her curse: she could spin a tale, rile up a crowd, but she couldn't hold it together under scrutiny. My lawyer David advised me to stay calm, document everything, and let her implode under her own arrogance. But it was difficult not to take it personally when strangers started whispering behind my back. Still, as much as it stung, the smear campaign only exposed her further when we traced the flyers back to a print shop where she had placed the order herself. Using HOA funds again, leaving a paper trail so obvious a child could follow it, I turned the evidence over to the county investigator who was already sniffing around Karen's finances, and the look on her face when she realized I had cornered her once again was something I'll never forget, like a cornered animal snarling before it lashes out. And lash out she did. One evening, as I was locking up my tools after repairing the front porch rail, I heard the roar of an engine, headlights blinding me, and before I knew it, a pickup truck was tearing across my property. Ripping through my newly planted landscaping, I dove out of the way as the truck veered dangerously close to the house before speeding off into the night. My security cameras caught every second, and while the driver's face was hidden, the license plate traced back to Karen's nephew. The sheriff's department took the matter seriously, issuing charges for property damage and reckless endangerment, and suddenly Karen's circle of allies grew even smaller. It was becoming impossible for her to hide behind the facade of being a concerned HOA president when her own family members were now implicated in criminal acts against me. The neighborhood, once tightly under her grip, was fracturing, and I could sense the tide turning. But Karen still had tricks left, and her next move was bolder than anything before. She attempted to forge documents claiming that my deed had been improperly filed, waving around counterfeit proof at the next HOA meeting like she had uncovered a scandal. I attended the meeting, standing at the back of the room with David beside me, and watched as Karen dramatically held up her so-called evidence, her voice rising with righteous indignation. For a moment, she had them people gasped, murmured. Some even clapped, but then David calmly stepped forward, presented the actual county's certified deed, and explained how Karen's evidence was a poorly crafted fake that wouldn't survive even a cursory review. Gasps turned into groans, murmurs into accusations, and suddenly the crowd was no longer with her. One resident shouted about their rising HOA fees, another about Karen's misuse of funds, and within minutes the meeting devolved into chaos, with Karen screaming over the crowd, her face red, her hands shaken as she tried to cling to control. I left that night knowing she was finished. But Karen wasn't someone who accepted defeat gracefully. She was the type who would rather burn everything to the ground than admit she was wrong. Over the following weeks, as lawsuits crumbled, as her supporters abandoned her, Karen grew more reckless. She started showing up outside my property at odd hours, standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed, glaring at me in silence for long stretches before storming off. It was unnerving, almost surreal, like being stalked by a ghost that refused to let go. I began to worry not just for my property, but for my safety, and David advised me to file for a restraining order, which the judge granted swiftly given the mountain of evidence we had. That legal blow seemed to push Karen over the edge completely, because the very next day, She attempted something so outrageous it bordered on self-destruction. She led a group of her dwindling supporters onto my land in broad daylight, declaring that they were taking it back for the community. Cameras caught the whole spectacle. Karen, waving her arms, shouting into a megaphone, demanding I vacate immediately, while her followers milled around uncertainly, some clearly regretting showing up. When the police arrived, Karen actually tried to argue with them, insisting that my home was illegally acquired and that they had the right to seize it. The officers didn't buy it for a second. Within minutes, they were dispersing the crowd, issuing trespassing citations, and warning Karen that she was treading on thin ice. But instead of retreating, Karen doubled down again, ranting at the officers, calling them corrupt, until finally they had no choice but to arrest her for disturbing the peace and violating my restraining order. Watching her being led away in handcuffs should have been satisfying, but instead, it left me with an eerie sense of foreboding. Because something told me this wasn't the end, it was merely the beginning of her unraveling. The HOA board, now in shambles, scrambled to distance themselves from her, claiming they had never supported her extreme tactics, but the damage was already done. The community was split, lawsuits piled up, and Karen's reputation was in tatters. My property, once mocked and derided, now stood as a monument to perseverance. While Karen's empire of control crumbled around her, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that she still had one last card to play. That somewhere deep in her warped sense of justice, she believed she could claw her way back. And as much as I wanted to believe the nightmare was over, I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to fade quietly into the background. No, she was the type to go down swinging, and I braced myself for whatever storm she was about to unleash next. Karen's arrest might have seemed like the climax to any ordinary feud, but for someone as unhinged and obsessed as her, it only lit the fuse on a bigger explosion. And I should have known better than to believe a night in a holding cell would break her spirit, because within days of being released, she emerged angrier, louder, and more determined to prove she was the rightful owner of what I had built, spewing accusations to anyone who would listen, and doubling down on her lies as if sheer volume could make them true. She went door to door in the neighborhood, knocking and pleading with residents to rally behind her, painting herself as a victim of corruption and conspiracy, insisting that I had manipulated the courts, bribed county officials, and stolen land that had always belonged to the HOA. But instead of finding sympathy, she encountered growing resentment from the very people she had bled dry with her endless legal battles. Neighbors told me stories later about slamming doors in her face, about how she screamed through windows when people refused to answer, about how she even stood in one man's driveway for nearly an hour, shrieking about how I was a thief, hiding behind a fancy lawyer. It would have been comical if it wasn't so unnerving, because I knew Karen's desperation made her dangerous, and she was becoming less predictable by the day. Meanwhile, the legal war continued to escalate, with my countersuit gaining momentum as David meticulously built a case showing Karen's repeated harassment, vandalism, misuse of HOA funds, and attempts to forge documents. The judge overseeing the case, who had grown visibly weary of Karen's theatrics, warned her sternly in one hearing that her behavior bordered on contempt of court. But Karen, in her arrogance, only smirked and muttered under her breath, refusing to take the warning seriously. The tipping point came one evening when I returned home to find my driveway blocked by a moving truck and a group of strangers unloading furniture onto my lawn. Shocked and furious, I demanded to know what they were doing, and one of them handed me a rental contract signed by Karen, who had apparently leased out my home to these unsuspecting tenants, convincing them she had authority as HOA president. My jaw nearly hit the ground at the audacity. While the tenants quickly realized they had been conned, the damage was done. My property had once again been invaded by Karen's madness. I called the sheriff immediately, and when officers tracked her down, the charges piled higher: fraud, attempted unlawful rental, and continued violation of the restraining order. The community watched in disbelief as Karen spiraled further, each move more outrageous than the last. And though many residents whispered that she needed professional help, none of them dared say it to her face for fear of becoming her next target. But the law was no longer on her side, and for the first time, I began to feel the scales tipping decisively in my favor. Still, there were nights I lay awake, wondering what she might try next. Because if Karen had proven anything, it was that she would rather destroy herself than let someone else win. That paranoia wasn't misplaced because one stormy night, my security system alerted me to movement in the backyard. And when I checked the cameras, my heart nearly stopped. There was Karen, soaked to the skin, wielding a crowbar, trying to pry open a basement window. I called the police immediately, narrating the live feed as they raced over. And by the time officers arrived, Karen was still clawing at the window like a woman possessed. This time, there was no slap on the wrist, no quick release. She was arrested for attempted breaking and entering, and the prosecutors finally moved to charge her fully, stacking the counts against her until even her most delusional arguments couldn't erase the reality. She was going to jail if convicted. The news spread like wildfire through the community, and neighbors who had once stayed neutral now openly condemned her, demanding her removal from the HOA board and calling emergency meetings to restructure leadership. For me, it was vindication, but it also felt surreal. Watching this woman, who had tormented me for so long, unravel so spectacularly. In court, she was a shadow of the tyrant who once lorded over the neighborhood. Her voice hoarse from screaming, her arguments nonsensical, her evidence discredited time and time again. David picked apart her case methodically, presenting surveillance footage, financial records, witness testimonies, and every document we had collected over months of harassment. And with each piece, Karen's defenses crumbled further. At one point, she grew so enraged that she pounded her fists on the table, shouting at the judge, accusing him of being biased until bailiffs had to escort her out to cool down. It was a spectacle that left no doubt in anyone's mind that Karen had crossed from persistence into madness. Yet even as the walls closed in on her, she still clung to the fantasy that she would somehow prevail, telling anyone who'd listen that appeals courts would side with her. That secret evidence would emerge proving I was a fraud, but all she really proved was how far denial could carry a person before reality finally crushed them. When the judge finally ruled in my favor, dismissing all of the HOA's baseless claims and granting my countersuit, the courtroom erupted with murmurs of relief and vindication. Karen, however, let out a wail so piercing it silenced the room, collapsing into her chair with her head in her hands, muttering this isn't over even as bailiffs prepared to take her back into custody for her other pending charges. For me, it was the beginning of freedom. The moment I knew I had not only defended my home, but also exposed Karen for what she truly was, a bully who believed she was above the law until the law finally caught up with her. But as I left the courthouse that day, the air thick with the whispers of neighbors and reporters, I couldn't shake the lingering question of what she might do next. Because while her power had been broken, her obsession was not yet extinguished, and deep down, I suspected her downfall was still only beginning. The months that followed Karen's sentencing were strange because for the first time in years, the neighborhood was quiet. No hostile notes on my door, no vandalism, no screaming HOA meetings where Karen stood at the front demanding obedience. And yet that quiet carried with it an unnerving sense of anticipation, as though everyone was holding their breath waiting for her next move. Because if there was one thing we all knew, it was that Karen never accepted defeat, and prison walls would never silence her obsession. I tried to focus on my life and on my home, pouring energy into renovations and finally finishing projects I'd put off because of constant distractions. Installing energy-efficient windows, refinishing the original oak floors, and restoring the antique staircase that had been hidden under layers of cheap carpeting for decades. And every improvement only seemed to emphasize the miraculous transformation of the house I'd bought for $2 into a showpiece worth millions. A fact that drew the attention of local media and even a national home renovation magazine, which ran a feature calling it the greatest real estate turnaround in the state. With all this publicity came more offers from developers and investors, some dangling blank checks in front of me, but I refused every one of them. Because this house wasn't about profit. It was about the principle that I had fought for. The home Karen had tried to steal and destroy, but had failed to touch in the end. Still, her shadow loomed, especially when whispers began circulating that Karen had been writing letters from prison to anyone who would listen, spinning her same story about how I had stolen her land, begging her dwindling supporters to stand strong until she returned. At first, I ignored these rumors, assuming they were nothing more than empty threats. But then came the day when David called me with a grim tone in his voice, telling me that Karen's attorney had filed yet another appeal, this time on the grounds of judicial misconduct, claiming that the judge in her case had been biased due to his friendship with one of my contractors. A claim so ridiculous that it would have been laughable if it weren't for the fact that the court was legally required to hear it. The thought of reliving months of hearings and testimony made my stomach turn. But David assured me that the appeal was flimsy and would be crushed quickly. Still, it was a reminder that Karen's reach was not yet severed. As the appeal dragged on, more bizarre incidents unfolded around the neighborhood. My mailbox smashed with a baseball bat one night. An anonymous call to the fire department reporting a fire hazard at my home that resulted in trucks showing up, sirens blazing only to find nothing, and even a strange car idling near my property line late at night, its headlights off until I stepped outside and it sped away into the dark. The sheriff's deputies investigated each event, and while they couldn't directly link them to Karen, everyone knew who was behind them, orchestrating chaos from her cell like a bitter queen clinging to her throne. Meanwhile, the HOA itself was crumbling, the board fractured by lawsuits, depleted funds, and distrust among neighbors, many of whom had resigned in disgust, leaving only a skeleton crew of volunteers to manage basic tasks like lawn maintenance and pool upkeep. Ironically, the collapse of the HOA freed many in the community from the stranglehold of its rules. And for the first time, people were planting what they wanted in their yards, putting up sheds without fear of fines and openly joking about how life was better without Karen's tyranny. But even as others celebrated, I couldn't relax, because Karen's voice still echoed in every corner of my life. From the appeal hearings where she demanded to be heard to the jailhouse calls where she ranted so loudly that even prosecutors winced as recordings were played in court. The turning point came one afternoon when David called again, his voice steadier this time, to inform me that the appellate court had dismissed Karen's claims in record time, ruling unanimously that her arguments were baseless and that the original sentencing stood, which meant that for at least the next several years, Karen would remain behind bars. Relief washed over me, but it was a guarded relief, because I had learned not to underestimate her resilience or her capacity for destruction. I celebrated quietly by hosting a small gathering at my home for the first time in years, inviting neighbors who had stood by me through the madness. And as we shared food and laughter under the glow of newly installed backyard lights, there was a sense of community that hadn't existed before, as though surviving Karen's reign had united us in a way nothing else could. Yet even that night, as I stood looking at the wooden beams of my house glowing warmly in the evening light, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that this wasn't truly the end, that Karen would never stop trying to claw her way back into relevance, and that when she finally walked free again, she would come straight for me. David, ever the realist, agreed, which is why he suggested we prepare for every possibility, filing motions for extended restraining orders, fortifying my legal protections, and even setting up a trust for the house that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to claim ownership falsely again. It was a sobering reminder that while I had won battles, the war might never truly end, not as long as Karen breathed and her obsession festered. And though I smiled for my neighbors and assured them that the worst was behind us, deep down I knew that the final act of this saga had not yet been written. And when it came, it would be more explosive than anything we had yet faced. Even after the courtroom victory that stripped Karen of her false claims and publicly exposed her schemes, the nightmare was far from over, because Karen's obsession with me and my house burned hotter than ever, and the jail cell only seemed to sharpen her hatred rather than diminish it. And though she was now facing multiple criminal charges, she still managed to reach beyond the bars with threats, letters, and whispered orders to those few loyal neighbors who still believed her lies. I remember the first week after the ruling. I came home to find graffiti sprayed across the wooden fence surrounding my property, words like thief and fraud in dripping red paint, the kind of juvenile vandalism that bore Karen's fingerprints even if she wasn't the one holding the spray can. And when I checked the cameras, it was one of her allies. A man who had previously shouted at me during an HOA meeting, now clearly doing her bidding. The sheriff's deputies moved quickly, arresting him and charging him with trespassing and vandalism. But it was proof that Karen's influence still lingered, poisoning the neighborhood. Meanwhile, my countersuit pressed forward, demanding restitution for the damages she had caused. And David kept reminding me to remain patient. That every outrageous stunt only made my case stronger. But patience was difficult when every day felt like waiting for the next attack. The next violation, the next headline-worthy meltdown. The financial records we had subpoenaed revealed that Karen had siphoned thousands of dollars from the HOA's reserve fund to pay for her legal battles, disguising the withdrawals as community improvement expenses, and when this information became public, the entire board turned on her, voting unanimously to expel her from her position as president and barring her from any involvement in neighborhood governance. It should have been the final nail in the coffin. But Karen, ever the delusional queen, declared that the vote was illegal and that she was still the rightful president, threatening lawsuits against the very people she once ruled over with an iron fist. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, and for the first time, the community began to rally around me, showing up at hearings to support my case, writing letters to the court about the trauma Karen had inflicted, and even stopping by to offer words of encouragement. Still, Karen's personal attacks intensified, and one of the most chilling moments came when I received a handwritten letter smuggled out of the jail, scrawled in messy handwriting that grew more erratic toward the end, where she promised that prison won't hold me forever and that she would take back what is mine when the gates open. I turned the letter over to the authorities, who added it to the mounting evidence of her harassment. But I couldn't deny the pit in my stomach each night as I checked locks and cameras twice before trying to sleep. David reassured me that the restraining order and criminal charges would keep her at bay, but I had seen how many times she had already broken those barriers, and the thought of her obsession festering in a cell made me more uneasy than relieved. The trial dragged on as Karen fought tooth and nail to delay the inevitable, filing motions, demanding appeals, and insisting she was the victim of some grand conspiracy orchestrated by me, the courts, and even the sheriff's department. But each attempt failed, and each ruling chipped away at her crumbling defenses. During one memorable session, she tried to represent herself, firing her attorney mid-trial and standing up in court to lecture the judge about property, rights, and sovereign authority, her arguments so bizarre that even the spectators laughed. And yet behind the comedy was a frightening reality. Karen truly believed she was untouchable. As the months passed, the property that had once been a modest wooden house, now fully renovated with modern touches and historical preservation grants, skyrocketed in value, appraisers estimating it at nearly $10 million. And the irony of it all was that the more valuable the home became, the more unhinged Karen grew, as though the rising worth was salt in her wounds, proof that she had lost something priceless through her own arrogance. I continued to work with David to secure my ownership ironclad, filing paperwork with the county that permanently protected the deed from fraudulent claims, and I also began documenting every single interaction, every threat, every rumor Karen spread, building an archive that would later become crucial in holding her accountable. Meanwhile, Karen's family, who had once quietly stayed out of her feuds, finally stepped into the spotlight, pleading with the court for leniency on her behalf, claiming she was suffering from untreated mental health issues. But the judge, hardened by months of her antics, made it clear that Karen's actions had gone far beyond eccentricity and into criminal territory. He ordered a psychological evaluation, and when the results came back, even the doctors testified that Karen's obsession with me and my house bordered on dangerous delusion. A diagnosis that simultaneously explained her behavior and cemented the fact that she could not be trusted in the community. Yet Karen clung to her fantasy like a drowning person clings to driftwood, ranting during her sentencing hearing that she would one day return to claim her property, screaming so loudly that deputies had to drag her from the courtroom as neighbors looked on, shaking their heads in disbelief. It was both terrifying and liberating to witness her unravel so publicly, because while part of me feared she might never truly stop, another part knew that the law was finally catching up to her in a way she could not escape. The community, once divided, had now united against her, filing lawsuits of their own to recover the HOA funds she had stolen, organizing petitions to prevent her from ever holding a leadership role again, and even repainting the neighborhood sign that once bore her name as president. Slowly, the weight lifted from my shoulders, though never entirely gone, because Karen was still a shadow in the back of my mind. And as I walked the halls of my now priceless wooden home, I couldn't help but wonder what the final chapter of this battle would look like, and whether Karen's downfall was complete, or if the worst was still waiting just around the corner. For a while after the appellate court struck down Karen's last desperate plea, it almost felt like life was finally returning to normal. But in truth, I knew deep down that the storm had only paused, not passed, and that Karen, even locked behind concrete walls, still plotted, still whispered, still believed she had a claim over something that was never hers to begin with. Because her obsession wasn't just about land or money anymore, it was about control, power, and the refusal to admit defeat. I spent those months securing every aspect of my life, installing reinforced gates, upgrading my surveillance to include license plate recognition, and legally transferring portions of the property's ownership into an irrevocable trust that made it airtight against any fraudulent claim. Yet the paranoia never fully left, because Karen's shadow was never far. Then came the day when David called me with a voice heavy with news I both expected and dreaded. Karen had been granted early parole on account of good behavior. My heart sank, because I knew good behavior in her case didn't mean redemption, it meant manipulation. That same talent she had always used to twist rules and people to her will. Within weeks of her release, the evidence of her presence was everywhere. A neighbor spotted her car parked 2 streets over, idling in the early morning hours. Another saw her at the grocery store, glaring at me from across the aisle before storming out without buying anything. At first, Karen kept her distance, careful not to violate the restraining order. But I knew she was testing boundaries, reminding me that she was free, reminding me that she still considered this unfinished business. Then the letters started again, shoved into my mailbox despite the court order. Rambling manifestos where she declared herself the rightful guardian of the community and demanded I return what was stolen. I handed every one of them to the sheriff's deputies, who warned her, but warnings never worked on Karen. They only fed her defiance. What struck me most was how much angrier she had become. If before she was arrogant and controlling, now she was desperate. Her words dripping with venom, her actions reckless. The final confrontation came late one night when my security cameras caught her on my property again, this time with a crowbar in hand, trying to pry open my back gate. I dialed 911 with my hands shaking, and deputies arrived within minutes, catching her in the act. But instead of surrendering, she screamed, fought, and had to be wrestled to the ground, shouting the entire time that this was her land, her house, her destiny. Watching her hauled off in handcuffs again, I felt a complex mix of relief and sorrow. Because as much as I hated what she had done to me, I could see that her obsession had hollowed her out, leaving only a shell of the woman she had once been. This time, though, the consequences were harsher. She was charged with violating parole, trespassing, and attempted breaking and entering. And the judge who presided over her case wasted no time in condemning her actions, sending her back to prison with the full weight of the law. The neighborhood, long exhausted by her reign of chaos, finally breathed a collective sigh of relief, and there was no sympathy left for her, not even from the handful of supporters she once commanded, because even they had seen her unravel and recognized that she had crossed lines that could never be undone. In the months after her second imprisonment, life changed in ways I never expected. The HOA collapsed entirely, dissolved by court order after years of mismanagement and corruption. And with it went all the rules and fines and petty control Karen had once weaponized against us. The neighbors formed a cooperative instead, a simple group dedicated only to maintaining shared spaces like the community garden and park. And for the first time in years, there was peace. My house, still the crown jewel of the area, continued to gain value, and with it came offers from historians and developers who wanted to preserve it as a landmark. But I still refused to sell, because the home had become more than property. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to standing firm against tyranny, greed, and obsession. Sometimes, when I sat on the restored porch in the evenings, I thought back to the day I bought it for $2, never imagining that it would not only change my financial future but also become the center of a battle that would expose corruption, unite a community, and bring down the most feared figure in our neighborhood. Karen, locked away and stripped of her power, had finally met the end of her reign, though part of me wondered if she still sat in her cell dreaming of one last chance, one last move. Because I knew her well enough to understand that she would never willingly accept defeat. But whether she schemed or not didn't matter anymore, because I was ready. The community was ready. The law was no longer blind to her tricks. The saga that had begun with a wooden house nearly falling apart had ended with a home, worth $10 million and a community free from the chokehold of a woman who thought herself invincible. And if there was one lesson to be drawn from it all, it was that no matter how powerful a Karen might seem, no matter how loud, controlling, or manipulative, the truth and perseverance will always outlast the lies. And as I looked out at my land, secure and unchallenged, I realized this was more than a victory for MIT, was a victory for everyone who had ever been bullied, controlled, or silenced by someone drunk on power. The story was over, but its echo would last, a reminder of how one house, one battle, and one unyielding stand could change everything. And if you followed this journey with me, from the moment I bought a house for $2 to the day I watched its would-be thief dragged off in handcuffs for the last time, then you know this. Stand firm, fight for what's yours, and never let anyone take your home, your peace, or your future, because in the end, justice does command. When it does, it's worth every struggle. Don't forget to subscribe to Sham Stories for more powerful tales of real drama, justice, and unforgettable battles against the Karens of the world. The first lawsuit landed on my doorstep like a bombshell, though in reality, it was little more than a stack of baseless accusations dressed up in legal language, claiming that my house had always been under HOA jurisdiction, that I had no right to renovate without their permission, and that my presence threatened community harmony. I sat at my kitchen table with the papers spread out in front of me, my blood boiling because it was so obviously a power grab. A desperate attempt to seize what they knew had grown far beyond their reach and value. Karen strutted around the neighborhood bragging that the HOA was going to reclaim the property, and turn it into a community center, even though she had no authority to do so, and her smug expression made it clear she thought she had already won. But I wasn't about to roll over. I hired a lawyer named David, a sharp-witted man with decades of experience in property law. And from the moment he read through the HOA's claims, he laughed out loud. "They've got nothing," he said, shaking his head, "but they'll make your life miserable dragging this out. You need to be prepared for war." And war it became. Every week I received another notice, another threat, another accusation. HOA members trespassed on my property, taking photos, measuring fences, and scribbling down nonsense about how my paint color didn't meet community standards even though. Again, my house wasn't inside their jurisdiction. I installed cameras, filed trespassing complaints, and each time the sheriff's office confirmed what I already knew, the HOA had no legal standing. Still, Karen was relentless. She rallied her board members to vote for a special action fund to cover legal expenses, which meant homeowners in the neighborhood were suddenly saddled with extra fees, and you could feel the discontent brewing. Some neighbors who had once laughed at me were now furious at Karen for draining their wallets to chase after my property. I knew then that time was on my side. While Karen burned bridges, I kept building mine, both literally and figuratively. The house was nearly complete now, restored to its full glory with gleaming oak beams, a wraparound porch, and carefully preserved vintage details that made it a showpiece. Real estate agents called non-stop, insisting I could fetch record-breaking offers. But I wasn't ready to sell. I wanted to see Karen stew a little longer. Watch her choke on the reality that the house she mocked was now the crown jewel of the area. But Karen wasn't done. One evening, as I returned from the hardware store, I found a group of HOA board members standing on my property line with clipboards. shouting that I was in violation of community construction hours. I laughed in their faces, reminding them they had no power here, but inside I knew Karen was escalating. The following week, I received a letter from the county zoning office claiming that my renovations had overstepped building codes. At first, my stomach dropped, thinking maybe Karen had finally found a weak spot. But David quickly uncovered the truth. Karen had been bombarding the zoning office with complaints, demanding inspections, and twisting the facts until an overworked clerk finally issued a notice just to shut her up. We appealed, and within days, the county confirmed everything was in order. Karen's face when she realized her scheme had backfired was priceless. But it also made me wary if she was willing to bend the truth that far. What would stop her from going even further? That question was answered soon enough. Late one night, my security cameras captured two figures sneaking onto my property, spray paint cans in hand, defacing the side of my newly painted house with graffiti that read HOA owned. My heart pounded as I watched the footage. But when I zoomed in and saw Karen's unmistakable silhouette, rage burned hotter than fear. She had crossed the line from harassment to criminal vandalism. I called the sheriff immediately, turned over the footage, and within days, Karen was served with charges. You'd think that would be the end of it, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. She called a special HOA meeting, rallying her supporters with a fiery speech about how I was stealing from the community, how my house belonged to all of us, and how she wouldn't rest until justice was served. Some residents cheered, but more of them grumbled about increased fees, pointless lawsuits, and the embarrassment Karen was dragging them into. Her empire was cracking, and I could see it in the way she avoided eye contact when walking past certain neighbors. Meanwhile, my lawyer filed a countersuit for harassment, damages, and legal fees. And suddenly the battlefield shifted. Instead of me defending my right to own my house, Karen now had to defend her reckless actions in front of a judge. During depositions, she grew increasingly unhinged, interrupting questions, shouting about community integrity, and even accusing me of bribing county officials. The court reporters could barely keep up with her rants. And David sat calmly across the table, smiling like a cat watching a mouse run in circles. Each time Karen lost her temper, she made our case stronger. The turning point came when we subpoenaed HOA financial records and uncovered that Karen had funneled thousands of dollars of HOA funds into these bogus legal fights without proper authorization. Homeowners were furious. Word spread like wildfire, and soon Karen was facing not just me in court but her own community, demanding answers. One by one, neighbors who once stayed silent began approaching me privately, apologizing for doubting me and offering support. They were tired of Karen's tyranny and wanted her gone. The woman who had once ruled the neighborhood with fear and control was now standing on quicksand. And the more she struggled, the faster she sank. But even as Karen's influence waned, I couldn't relax. She was unpredictable, desperate, and dangerous, and I knew she wasn't finished yet. Every time I saw her glare at me from across the street, her eyes burning with hatred, I felt the weight of the storm still gathering. She had already tried vandalism, lies, and legal manipulation. What would she try next? I couldn't know for sure, but one thing was certain. Karen wasn't going down without a fight. And the next move she made might be the one that pushed everything over the edge. Karen's arrest might have seemed like the climax to any ordinary feud. But for someone as unhinged and obsessed as her, it only lit the fuse on a bigger explosion. And I should have known better than to believe a night in a holding cell would break her spirit, because within days of being released, she emerged angrier, louder, and more determined to prove she was the rightful owner of what I had built. Spewing accusations to anyone who would listen and doubling down on her lies as if sheer volume could make them true. She went door to door in the neighborhood, knocking and pleading with residents to rally behind her, painting herself as a victim of corruption and conspiracy, insisting that I had manipulated the courts, bribed county officials, and stolen land that had always belonged to the HOA, but instead of finding sympathy, she encountered growing resentment from the very people she had bled dry with her endless legal battles. Neighbors told me stories later about slamming doors in her face, about how she screamed through windows when people refused to answer, about how she even stood in one man's driveway. For nearly an hour shrieking about how I was a thief hiding behind a fancy lawyer. It would have been comical if it wasn't so unnerving, because I knew Karen's desperation made her dangerous, and she was becoming less predictable by the day. Meanwhile, the legal war continued to escalate, with my countersuit gaining momentum as David meticulously built a case showing Karen's repeated harassment, vandalism, misuse of HOA funds, and attempts to forge documents. The judge overseeing the case, who had grown visibly weary of Karen's theatrics, warned her sternly in one hearing that her behavior bordered on contempt of court. But Karen, in her arrogance, only smirked and muttered under her breath, refusing to take the warning seriously. The tipping point came one evening when I returned home to find my driveway blocked by a moving truck and a group of strangers unloading furniture onto my lawn. Shocked and furious, I demanded to know what they were doing, and one of them handed me a rental contract signed by Karen, who had apparently leased out my home to these unsuspecting tenants. Convincing them she had authority as HOA president, my jaw nearly hit the ground at the audacity. And while the tenants quickly realized they had been conned, the damage was done. My property had once again been invaded by Karen's madness. I called the sheriff immediately, and when officers tracked her down, the charges piled higher: fraud, attempted unlawful rental, and continued violation of the restraining order. The community watched in disbelief as Karen spiraled further, each move more outrageous than the last. And though many residents whispered that she needed professional help, none of them dared say it to her face for fear of becoming her next target. But the law was no longer on her side, and for the first time, I began to feel the scales tipping decisively in my favor. Still, there were nights I lay awake wondering what she might try next. Yes. Because if Karen had proven anything, it was that she would rather destroy herself than let someone else win. That paranoia wasn't misplaced, because one stormy night, my security system alerted me to movement in the backyard, and when I checked the cameras, my heart nearly stopped. There was Karen, soaked to the skin, wielding a crowbar, trying to pry open a basement window. I called the police immediately, narrating the live feed as they raced over. And by the time officers arrived, Karen was still clawing at the window like a woman possessed. This time, there was no slap on the wrist, no quick release. She was arrested for attempted breaking and entering, and the prosecutors finally moved to charge her fully, stacking the counts against her until even her most delusional arguments couldn't erase the reality. She was going to jail if convicted. The news spread like wildfire through the community, and neighbors who had once stayed neutral now openly condemned her, demanding her removal from the HOA board and calling emergency meetings to restructure leadership. For me, it was vindication, but it also felt surreal. Watching this woman who had tormented me for so long unravel so spectacularly. In court, she was a shadow of the tyrant who once lorded over the neighborhood. Her voice hoarse from screaming, her arguments nonsensical, her evidence discredited time and time again. David picked apart her case methodically, presenting surveillance footage, financial records, witness testimonies, and every document we had collected over months of harassment. And with each piece, Karen's defenses crumbled further. At one point, she grew so enraged that she pounded her fists on the table, shouting at the judge, accusing him of being biased, until bailiffs had to escort her out to cool down. It was a spectacle that left no doubt in anyone's mind that Karen had crossed from persistence into madness. Yet even as the walls closed in on her, she still clung to the fantasy that she would somehow prevail, telling anyone who'd listen that appeals courts would side with her. That secret evidence would emerge, proving I was a fraud. But all she really proved was how far denial could carry a person before reality finally crushed them. When the judge finally ruled in my favor, dismissing all of the HOA's baseless claims and granting my countersuit, the courtroom erupted with murmurs of relief and vindication. Karen, however, let out a wail so piercing it silenced the room, collapsing into her chair with her head in her hands, muttering, "This isn't over," even as bailiffs prepared to take her back into custody for her other pending charges. For me, it was the beginning of freedom. The moment I knew I had not only defended my home, but also exposed Karen for what she truly was, a bully who believed she was above the law until the law finally caught up with her. But as I left the courthouse that day, the air thick with the whispers of neighbors and reporters, I couldn't shake the lingering question of what she might do next, because while her power had been broken, her obsession was not yet extinguished. And deep down, I suspected her downfall was still only beginning.